Hi, my name is Stéphane Farou, and I'm the author of Getting the Message Across, a book in which I provide ideas on how to use presentation software such as PowerPoint to give interesting technical presentations. In this short series of videos, I'm focusing on one of the points I'm explaining in each chapter. Chapter 1 is about general presentation design and deals with slide size, colors, backgrounds, and fonts, which will be the subject of this video. Whenever you design a presentation, you need to think about this guy. Your slides are supposed to support a presentation. Anybody in the room should be able to see them comfortably. That means that whenever you show some text, whether it's an important message, computer code, labels in a diagram or a chart, it needs to be big enough to remain legible for the people in the back row. Size 10 is far too small. I usually consider that the comfort zone is somewhere between 24 and 36 included. Bigger, it starts looking like a title, and it's impractical when you need to display more than a few words. Think, once again, of computer code or of a busy diagram. If size matters, it's not though the only concern. One well-known characteristic of fonts is the presence or absence of small decorative strokes called serifs. If you look at a serif font such as Times Roman, these strokes are serifs. Serif fonts are those used in printed books because serifs improve the legibility of a long printing line. By contrast, other fonts such as Arial lack these strokes and are called sans serif fonts. Sans means without in French. There are, of course, on your computer many other serif fonts than Times New Roman, and many other sans serif fonts than Arial. Another interesting characteristic of most serif fonts can be found in, for instance, the G of Georgia. You can see easily that the width of the lines that draw the letter are inconstant. Some parts are narrow and some parts are wide. This is very elegant, but it can make letters confusing from afar. This is also why sans serif fonts are easier to read from a distance, especially for short text. Road signs use sans serif fonts, and so do posters. Books also often use them for titles and subtitles. As you shouldn't have a lot of long lines on your slides and they should be easily readable, it's recommended to use sans serif fonts in presentations as well. Those two families of fonts are not the only ones. To present computer code, a monospace font in which all letters have the same width works best. Some of these fonts, such as Courier New, have serifs. Others only have serifs to make narrow letters such as I or L look wider and avoid unpleasant visual gaps between letters. Finally, you also have fancy fonts that don't fall neatly into any of the previous categories. Comic Sans, a fancy sans serif font, is an example, but also the red unwritten font that I've used to write font family names. Now there is something important to notice. I have given the same size to all letters, yet, and it's obvious when you compare the names of Verdana and Calibri, some fonts look bigger than others. In fact, some fonts are wider or taller than others, and the font size is just one aspect of how big some text looks. So, should we favor wide or tight fonts? The best way to decide is to compare two sans serif fonts, Verdana again, and a super tight common font called Impact. When written small, this is size 20, Verdana reads very well and Impact is almost illegible. Verdana was designed for small displays. However, when written very large, as in size 96, Verdana is spread wide and becomes hard to read, while Impact becomes quite legible. There are tools in PowerPoint that allow making text tighter or looser, but usually it doesn't look as good as the font as originally designed. To answer the question which one to choose, as we try to make the text big enough to be readable by the guy in the back row, we should favor tight fonts. Not necessarily the tightest font available, but something tight enough. There is a wide collection of tight sans serif fonts that are either commonly installed on computers or easy to find. And of course, what I said of sans serif fonts is also true for other font families. As you can see here, although Korean New is commonly used for computer code, it's probably not as good a choice as ConsoleS, and I usually use Inconsolata, that is even tighter. In most of my presentations, which revolve around IT or computer science, I have three basic fonts: a sans serif font for text, a monospace font for code, and a handwritten font for annotations that appear here and there, as in this video. Depending on the topic, needs may differ. Let's take mathematics as an example. You are probably unfamiliar with the face of this guy, and I'm not sure that the name of this English mathematician immediately rings a bell. Yet, in some circles, Taylor's formula is quite famous and expresses that you can compute the value of a continuous function in the close vicinity of a point with the precision you wish by computing the values of successive derivatives of the function in this point. I have used here 4 fonts, and yet the result is relatively harmonious. You can see a sans serif font for the title, Inconsolata for most of the formula, except for F's and X's that are written using a calligraphic font, as is customary in mathematics. Finally, a fancy period font was used for the name and live data of Taylor. As you can see, there is quite a lot of freedom about which fonts to use. However, avoid Comic Sans like the plague. Most people find it corny rather than friendly and informal.